Hilltown boys and girls get a special visit each Christmas. December evenings, after the Berkshire sun has long since retreated below the lumpy peaks of the nearby horizon, after the milking parlor lights have been switched off, after the supper dishes have been washed and dried and put up in the cupboard again, little children begin the rituals of winter evenings which have changed only slightly over the years. After bath time and changing into jammies, and before brushing their teeth and saying their bedside prayers, the evenings were filled with activities which ranged over the years, from hearing Dad read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," to listening to the Atwater Kent radio, to watching the Ed Sullivan Show, to putting the Muppets' Christmas Carol into the VCR, to playing that last video game, and checking the email now before bed. The technology of that hour has changed, but the special quiet of that time, which holds these families in its embrace, continues to knit parents and children and values together in a fabric which withstands the fury of change, and which outsiders to the Hilltown find difficult to understand. Well, as I said, these folks get a special visit on one evening in December, usually the Sunday before Christmas. Every year since 1931, kids listen hard to hear a peculiar puff, puff, hiss, whistle, and a crunching sound that accompanies it, followed close by with a knock on the door, and then the puffs and whistles and hisses retreat into the snowy night. The children run to the door with great excitement, hoping to catch a glimpse of what their parents assure them is Santa's sleigh on a practice run through the Hilltown, and upon opening the door, they find a little white bag bearing the name of each child in the house, filled with homemade Christmas ribbon candy. The older, more perceptive children recall the huffing and hissing and whistling sounds every Flag Day when Judge Harry Hoyle drives his shiny 1909 white manufacturing steam car in the big parade down the main street of the village. Moms give a knowing smile to Henrietta Hoyle when at each ladies' auxiliary bazaar at the village church she lays out a table of ribbon candies, peanut brickle, homemade chocolates and fudge, rock sugar sticks, and all sorts of tempting confections, while the teenagers can put two and two together. But the visit is still magic for the younger children. Harry was a bright-eyed law student in 1929 when he realized that Henrietta Streeter was probably the only girl that would ever put up with his left-wing rantings and understand his passion for the downtrodden and his vision as a closet socialist in a decidedly pro-Hoover enclave. Not only that, but she was the cutest girl in all the world and could cook better than his mother. Henrietta was being courted by several hopeful farm boys, but Harry had an ace in the hole that would prove invaluable in winning this war with Cupid. It was that 1909 white steam car given to him by his father when he started college. It had been his uncle's car since it was new, but now, 18 years later, it was given to Harry so that he could commute on the weekends back and forth from Amherst College. On the campus, the car was his bane, a dinosaur, slower than the newer gasoline cars. It was a relic of the farmer boy's hick upbringing. He was teased without mercy by the rich boys there, but back in the Hilltown, the tables were turned, as the other real farm boys there were limited to courting in Mrs. Streeter's front parlor, while Harry could whisk Henrietta away in his sleek and silent car for endless hours of fascination. Well, it worked, and they were married in November of 1929, and I always suspected that it was his success with Henrietta and his unfair advantage with that steam car, even more than his unusual politics, that set Harry Hoyle at odds with the other young men in town. Well, now they had been married for 2 years, and Harry had just graduated, and he had passed the Massachusetts bar exam, and his uncle took him into his practice down in Northampton. Harry drove down to the Hampshire County Courthouse every day and buried himself in musty old probate records. He had been itching to become the next Clarence Darrow, and he was eager to do something to relieve the depression of the depression. There was further cause for sadness in the Hoyle home, as after 2 years of trying, it was becoming more and more evident that no children would be gracing that little house way out on Old Stage Road. Henrietta had grown up with visions of a home filled with children and the smells of large meals cooking, and in her disappointment she began to fill her time with baking and with candy making. Her creations were at once splendid and spectacular, and many a customer stopped in to Henrietta's kitchen over the next several decades for, chocolates in February and maple sugar candies in March. It was hot cross buns in April, wedding cakes in June, of course, and so forth and so on throughout the year. There were rock sugar candies for Halloween and pies for Thanksgiving, and Henrietta's famous gingerbread men for Christmas. Well, no picnic auction or church supper or bazaar, no funeral collation or any event at the community house was considered complete without something from that famous wood-burning Glenwood range that had become the heart and the soul of the Hoyle home, and in some ways it was the heart and soul of the hill town as well. That first Christmas trip over the icy roads of the hill town occurred in 1931, and it continued without interruption for the next 70 years. Young Councillor Hoyle in time became Judge Hoyle, and he and Mrs. Hoyle and that 1909 white car steamed through Christmas after Christmas in the procession of years through the 20th century. Children grew, and they grew up, and they married off, and they took over homesteads, they took over farms from the elders. They had children of their own, and some moved away from town, and some moved into town. And through all of the tumult of the years, through wars and economic downturns and then subsequent recoveries and then more wars, through crazy fads and dangerous politics, through assassinations and political unrest, Hilltowners were reassured each Christmas by the quiet puffing and whistling and hissing coming up their drives, and they were assured that all was still right in their little world, no matter what was happening elsewhere. In the late 90s, when Judge and Mrs. Hoyle were in their late 80s, folks wondered if one year they might not hear those familiar reassuring sounds, and yet still they came, to everyone's delight and to everyone's comfort. The Hoyles, of course, would never admit to any of it. Each year, Harry would check over the little white bags, and he would put them in order of the itinerary, down the old post road, crisscrossing the near mountain, and then down into the village, and then finally up over the south mountain side of town, until each home with a child had been visited. He would recheck the town meeting records and the newspaper birth notices to be sure that nobody was missed, and then he would get out his calligraphy pen and carefully inscribe each bag with the names of the children at each stop. And when this was done, he would go out to the shed and fill that steam car with the nearly 80 gallons of water that it needed to fire up the boiler. And in the meantime, Henrietta would be finishing up the candy making, which would have started early that morning. And then she filled each one of those bags, and she tied them up with a ribbon, and she put them carefully in order in apple crates that would fill up the back seat of the steam car. And after supper, the car would be up to temperature, the back seat fully loaded, and the Hoyles would be off on their marvelous journey. And between houses they would sing Christmas carols to each other and together, but they would keep silence as they approached each house, so as not to spoil the illusion of Santa Claus in his sleigh whistling to his 8 reindeer as they huffed and puffed up to each farmhouse. Now, Henrietta fell and broke her hip on their 72nd anniversary this past year. Judge Hoyle followed the ambulance down to Cooley Dickinson Hospital down in the valley in his Lincoln Town Car. You know, the steamer had long since been relegated to parades and to their annual secret trip. While in the hospital, Henrietta contracted pneumonia and she passed away. It was the day after Thanksgiving. And Harry Hoyle buried his beloved Hank, as he fondly called her. And for the first time, and as long as anyone could remember, there were store-bought goods at a Hilltown funeral collation. Harry takes his morning coffee and dry toast at the coffee shop in the village. He spends a couple of hours in his makeshift office at the community house, where ever since his retirement, he's offered free legal advice to Hilltowners. Mostly it's preparing wills and helping them with health proxies and things like that. The village matrons all take turns bringing him a basket lunch. And then he retreats to the little house that Hank and he made home for all those years up on Old Stage Road, and he makes himself some tea and lights a fire in the fireplace, and he works on his memoirs on a little laptop computer that was given to him at his retirement party. And usually he falls fast asleep in that big leather chair with a book on his lap. And often he spends the night in that chair. Harry feels so lonely, so sad. Well, I suppose he just thought they'd go on forever together, the two of them, two strong partners with no hint of slowing down until it was too late. Well, the truth is Henrietta had been slowing down, and she knew it, but Harry wasn't having any of it, and now Hank was gone, and so was Harry's reason to go on. And he couldn't watch her decorating the tree that wasn't there. He couldn't feel her in his arms as he danced around the kitchen. There were no familiar smells wafting from the Glenwood, which now sat cold and still. He missed her constant humming and her singing. Christmas was a distant memory, and Judge Hoyle reckoned that 70 trips over the mountains and the village between, well, that was probably going to be just about enough. He was done. Just last week, as Harry drifted in and out of sleep, wandering between his memories and dreams of life in the hill town, he thought he heard a knock on the gathering darkness of the longest night of the year. Whether it was the echo of his judge's gavel, or whether it was the sound of his father's horses hauling the hay wagon over the ledge rock in the field, or maybe it was the sound of Hank knocking some molten sugar off a wooden spoon. Harry couldn't be sure. And slowly he came to a conscious state, and he was in that big leather chair. And a log had rolled off the top of the fire and had fallen onto the hearthstone. And he looked at it. He tried to decide whether the log could have awakened him, and the knock came again. This time it was clear. It was a knock on the door. And Judge Hoyle grumbled to himself about who might be at his door this late and this far out of town and this close to Christmas and this kind of cold. Well, you can just imagine his state of mind at having to drag himself up out of that warm and cozy leather chair and make his way to the front door. And when he got the door open, well, there was nobody there. Nobody standing expectantly on the doorstep. There were no Christmas carolers. He looked, there were no taillights retreating down the old road back toward the village. There was just the white blanket of snow and the crisp Hilltown air and the bright, starry night. And there was Orion the hunter. He was so close over the North Mountain you could just about reach out and touch him. And Judge Hoyle was puzzled momentarily, but this gave way to irritation when he noticed a light coming from the shed. He grabbed his hat and his gloves, and he threw on his coat around his shoulders, and he set out to the shed to put out the lights, although he didn't remember turning them on when he parked the town car earlier that afternoon. And when he got to the shed, he was astounded by what he saw. There was the white steamer, fired up, puffing softly. With a low whistle coming from her, she was fully up to pressure and ready to go. And in the back of that car, crates of white bags sat in neat rows waiting to be delivered. And Judge Hoyle looked closely, and he noticed that the bags bore the names of the children, all in different handwriting. But all were neatly packed, and they were in just the right order. He was stupefied, and he looked around. He saw nobody in the shed. He shouted out, "Hello!" But his call received no response, caused no movement in the shed. Judge Hoyle slid into the seat of his old steam car, and he found a letter sitting on the passenger seat. It was addressed to him in his wife's handwriting. Oh, seeing her handwriting like this gave him such a powerful tug, a powerful jolt, such a personal reminder of her. He opened the letter. "Dear Harry, I'm sorry I can't be with you to make this special delivery. I hope you weren't for a moment thinking that you wouldn't be bothered this year. I know how lonely you feel. It is the feeling that I felt every day after you left for Northampton for the courthouse. I would miss the way you would smell after shaving. I would miss the familiar tone of your voice as you sang to me. Oh, I listened. I would miss the softness of your lips on mine, and I yearned to be held just a little longer before you left. Maybe one of your silly kitchen polkas are on the table. I looked forward to the time each evening when you would return. Oh, Harry, we mean so much to each other, you and I. And so to be closer to you in your absence, I would set about with the rituals of keeping your house and loving you in ways that you still may not be aware of. Oh, Harry, don't you see? It is in the keeping of these little rituals that we keep love alive when we're apart, one from the other. All these years, I suppose we thought that giving this candy to our children was about giving the gift of the spirit of Christmas, but we both know that in giving we receive. We have received blessings from our children in far greater abundance than we have ever given them. Dear Harry, I wanted this to be my gift to you this Christmas, the keeping of this annual ritual of love for you, for me, for the children. And I know from experience that by keeping this ritual, the time when we are together again will be made infinitely shorter. Merry Christmas, my love. Hank." Judge Hoyle turned left out of the drive and headed down the old post road with his steam car full of candy. He couldn't see too well from the tears in his eyes, but that's okay. He knew the way.